Okie dokie. Well, I am just too excited, so I'm not going to wait anymore. Welcome back for those of you that have joined us at a previous Policy Corner. And for those of you that are just joining, thank you for joining us today. My name is Ellen Miller, and I am NIJC's Pro Bono Manager. We are back for our monthly Policy Corner presentation, and today we are talking about defending the right to asylum, a Sisyphean task. Every month, we're gathering in this virtual Policy Corner to engage with you, our community, with updates on current issues in immigration policy and how it impacts our clients and their ability to access legal services, legal protections. For this webinar, all participants are muted. We are quite the number today, so that's great. But we do encourage you to ask any questions and leave a comment in the comment box. So there's a little chat function over there. We'll be monitoring these throughout the presentation and then also be opening for a question and answer at the end. We'll leave a good chunk of time at the end to get through most of your questions today. There are 3 handouts you should be able to access. One is a what can you do information sheet with a bunch of links for after participation. And then a number of timelines that we'll be referencing in the presentation. Just so you know, we will also be sending all materials in a follow-up email after this presentation. So for those of you for whom this is your first time interacting with NIJC, I'm just going to give a brief overview of who we are and what we do. So the National Immigrant Justice Center, we are a broad-based immigration legal service provider. Our headquarters is in Chicago, and we have offices in 5 cities across the United States, including 2 in Indiana, Washington, D.C., and San Diego, California. We serve over 10,000 non-citizens every year. And with the support of this community and our pro bono network, we are defending the legal rights of immigrants, regardless of their background, and we work to transform the immigration system to one that affords equal opportunity for all. Our service model includes high volume direct legal services, high volume litigation, and zealous policy work. These components are all working together so that we can take the stories of our clients and our attorneys to influence the litigation and policy goals. But just like Sisyphus, we need your help pushing this boulder up the hill. It's been a real year, hasn't it? So thank you for showing up and for staying informed on these current issues. Now I have the privilege of introducing my 2 colleagues, Azadeh Afrani, who is a senior policy analyst, and Amanda Cruz-Slazek, who is a supervising attorney with our asylum project. Azadeh?
Thank you so much, Ellen. And I just want to echo Ellen's thanks for everyone joining us today. There's so many competing priorities going on right now and so much going on in the world. So thanks for taking the time to really engage on this issue and to think through with us how we can, defend the right to asylum, which has been under such vicious attacks over the past few years. So today we're going to start by taking a few steps back and thinking about why we have asylum laws in the first place. What's the history that led up to it internationally, and how did we get to the asylum system that we have in the United States? After that, we're going to fast forward to the state of asylum in 2020, and one of our fantastic asylum attorneys, Amanda, is going to share the story of one of our clients who has been impacted by the changes that we're discussing. And after that, we hope that you're going to stay with us so that we talk about how NIJC is fighting back and how you can get involved as well. So on the next slide, why do we have asylum laws in the first place? There's obviously not enough time within the time that we have today to actually delve deep into the history of asylum laws. But I thought it would be helpful to think about its history and what are the highlights about that history. and why it's in existence in the United States. So the first thing to know is that asylum was born out of the atrocities of global warfare and genocide. So it was a response to a crisis, an unprecedented crisis at that, where the entire world was involved. So that's something to keep in mind, because nowadays one of the things that we see routinely is nations, including the US, using crises in order to shoulder off responsibility, even though that's precisely the situation that led to the creation of asylum in the first place. One of the things to keep in mind is that the categories of asylum eligibility that we have in the US and throughout the world came out of an international momentum that was the Refugee Convention in 1951. So in 1951, the world agreed that there were certain categories of claims that warranted the grant of asylum. And frankly, those categories haven't really been updated, despite the fact that the reasons why people are fleeing throughout the world have changed as well. But one of the biggest wins of this international instrument, which is the Refugee Convention, is that there was consensus around the world and an obligation under international law not to return asylum seekers straight back to the danger that they're fleeing. That's a principle that's called non-refoulement in French, and it basically captures that requirement not to send people back to their persecutors. Fast forward to 1980, that's the first piece of legislation in the United States that actually articulates an asylum system and codifies the obligations that we have under international law. That system really was engineered in order to create uniformity throughout the country. But as you may be able to see at the bottom of the slide, there's a really interesting article from the San Diego Union Tribune that does a deep dive into what the past 40 years have looked like for asylum law, and how, for example, someone who has a claim, an asylum claim, may win protection in Chicago while getting deported in Atlanta for the same exact type of claim. So there's a lot of issues in this system that have not been fixed. And unfortunately, under the Trump administration, they have exploited these vulnerabilities and amplified them exponentially. And so capitalizing on the system that's already fallen short of its promise is really the context that brought us the last 3 years of this administration. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about what that looks like in 2020. So in your materials, as Ellen has gestured at the beginning, I think it's on the right side of your screen, you should be able to see handouts, and those include 2 timelines. One is the full timeline that we have on our website, which we update regularly every couple of weeks or so. And it's also at the bottom of the screen on the left side. There's a link to it. That timeline basically talks through all of the minutia of attacks that we've been seeing over the past 4 years. Because we don't have time to go through all of this, we're actually just going to focus on what's been happening in 2020. And believe it or not, a lot has been happening just over the past 9 months. So I know the text may be really hard to read, so if you're interested, you could pull up the timeline on the 2020 timeline in your materials on the side, but you don't need to as well if you prefer to just listen through, because I'm going to focus on some of the larger patterns that are symptomatic. So one of the things that has been a characteristic of 2020 is the amplified effort that we've seen under the Trump administration to basically push asylum seekers out of US borders. So in January of 2019, over a year and a half ago, the administration created a program that forced asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while their cases were pending in the United States. over 60,000 people were forced to stay in Mexico, often in very unsafe conditions, which included people being abducted, extorted, murdered, and raped. In February of 2020, after many, many months of litigation, a court of appeals finally found that this principle that we talked about that is enshrined in international law and the Refugee Act, the principle of not returning asylum seekers to dangerous conditions, is being violated all the time with the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico program. And that asylum seekers essentially don't have sufficient protections to be free from undue risk to their lives and freedom. Unfortunately, in less than a couple days, that order was halted by the U.S. government, who appealed and brought it up to the Supreme Court, and the border was closed again, shutting the door on the 60,000 people who were anxiously waiting to just be safely processed in the United States. And speaking of the fact that there's this attempt to push asylum seekers away, 2020 was also the year in which the US grew its program of sending asylum seekers that it apprehended at the border all the way back to Guatemala. And in Guatemala, they were supposed to be processed for asylum, basically making Guatemala a proxy for the US repression of asylum seekers. So in early 2020, they sent more and more people in Guatemala's way before the pandemic. And unfortunately, there's nowhere near the safety or the infrastructure to protect asylum seekers in Guatemala. And the vast majority of individuals who were sent there, many of whom were women and children, ended up self-deporting or giving up their claims. And unfortunately, that's exactly what the administration wanted. By offshoring asylum seekers to either Mexico or Guatemala, the Trump administration was trying to ensure that they would give up their claims and essentially trying to end asylum for those populations. The second thing I want to point out, since we're talking about 2020, is that you can't talk about 2020 without talking about public health. And unfortunately, that's also true of the right to asylum, because this administration has really, truly weaponized this pandemic to virtually end asylum at the border. So in March 2020, the CDC issued an unprecedented order which closed the border altogether to everyone, including asylum seekers, despite an outcry from the public health expert community that there's just no justification for this drastic move and and violation of US and international law. As a side note, we just discovered this weekend, the AP reported that basically Vice President Pence and Acting Secretary Chad Wolf strong-armed the CDC director in issuing that order, which explains why an agency like the CDC, which is completely disinterested in immigration control, would all of a sudden meddle with sealing the border to all migration. Unfortunately, the border remains closed ever since, and everyone who has appeared at the border, or nearly everyone, has been expelled in clear violation of both the Refugee Convention and Congress's Refugee Act of 1980. That's about, believe it or not, 150,000 people who have been expelled under this, the CDC's border closure. But the Trump administration didn't actually end there when it comes to weaponizing this pandemic. This summer, and that's one of the things that you can see in the yellow section of the timeline, they issued a proposed regulation that would label asylum seekers as dangerous to national security just because they came from countries or traveled around the world or traveled through countries where there is a communicable disease. Now, if you're asking yourself, how could a country with the highest number of COVID cases and deaths in the world do this? Isn't it ironic, right? Didn't the US government pause and ask itself, how can we do this? Unfortunately, they didn't. And they also didn't pause to ask whether it made sense under the, given the history of asylum being born out of crisis, to weaponize a crisis in order to end asylum compliance altogether. So the administration has really no good answers for those questions. The other thing I want to mention is that this year has been a year of reckoning for the US in terms of race-based discrimination. And unfortunately, immigration laws have always been heavily impacted by racial bias as well. So you probably won't be surprised that anti-asylum policies have also been discriminatory, essentially blocking asylum for people on the basis of their national origin, gender, LGBTQ status. So there was a comment in particular, a proposed regulation that came out in June and finalized in July. And that's also in your abbreviated timeline that talks about basically ending asylum altogether for anyone who is a woman fleeing gender-based violence, who is Central American, who's LGBTQ, or who is a survivor of gang violence. So again, that's a very troubling development given the moment of reckoning that we have nationwide. Last but not least, this year has also been the year of hyper-regulation. So this is an administration that usually says that it's promoting deregulating government, but when it comes to asylum, it couldn't be farther from the truth. So just in 2020, the Trump administration has issued 8 anti-asylum proposed regulations, peppered through this one-pager. Some of them took effect immediately, like the border closure of the CDC, that was also a form of regulation, while others went through the notice and comment process, are still pending, and received feedback from NIJC and its supporters as well about the devastating impact of these rules. Unfortunately, some of them have also become final, like one that became final in August, which imposed a wealth tax on the right to asylum, essentially requiring asylum seekers, most of whom drop everything in order to come and seek protection, to muster a fee in order to have access to this basic form of protection. If this sounds cruel, generally speaking, it's because it is. The US is only the 4th country in the world to impose a fee on the right to asylum. There's basically international consensus that when you do that, you're going to deter or stop people from applying for asylum and violate international and domestic law. So stay tuned, because we're going to talk a little bit more about the regulatory process, because just as I mentioned, there's been 8 different rules issued this year, and there's one that's currently pending that we would love to share with you and see if you'd be interested in commenting. And NIJC has created a campaign around that, and that can be a wonderful way for you to weigh in defense of the right to asylum. But if your head is spinning by all of this already, just this brief overview of 2020, just imagine how this process would feel from the perspective of an asylum seeker. And on a daily basis, basically, asylum seekers and their attorneys are fighting this war of attrition. And one of our strengths as the policy team is that we get to amplify this reality through attorneys like Amanda, who's fighting for the right to asylum. So I'll pass it on to her next.
Thanks, Azadeh, and thanks everyone for being here today. As Azadeh explained, my name is Amanda Cruz-Lazak, and I'm an attorney here with NIJC, and I supervise the asylum project's in-house asylum claims. So I'm going to tell you about one of our clients, Iris, whose case in many ways exemplifies the many, many obstacles that asylum seekers face in light of the new bars and the new regulations that have gone through over the past few years, and the ones we're currently facing now that have been announced. So Iris is a Honduran woman who fled to the United States after suffering a lifetime of harm in Honduras, starting when she was just a child. Her father, his friends, and other men in her community abused her as a young girl when she was living at home. And because of that, she moved to live with her sister and her sister's husband when she was just a young teenager. But unfortunately, the abuse continued at the hands of her sister's husband. And so to escape that harm, she decided to move in with her boyfriend and his family, who knew of the abuse that she had suffered previously and promised to protect her from it. But unfortunately, as soon as she moved in with him and his family, he began to treat her as if she were his property. He hurt her in a myriad of ways, forced her to stop working, and really having any kind of independent life for herself at that point. And this relationship really began years of Iris living in fear and suffering unimaginable violence at the hands of this man, and trying to escape and find protection in different parts of Honduras, but really never being able to do so. And over the course of her relationship with this man, Iris gave birth to 3 daughters. And she also actually cared for the daughter of her abuser from a different relationship, since that child was an infant. And she thought of this child as her own daughter as well. But the fact that she was the mother of this man's children cemented really her connection to him. And he became more and more aggressive and violent towards her over time, knowing that she was forever tied to him because of the children that they shared in common and other factors, be they economic or social or cultural. She was tied to him forever. In addition to that, her abuser had connections to a very powerful gang in Honduras, and because of his connection to this gang, Iris and her daughters were targeted by rival gang members. So not only were they facing harm and persecution at the hands of her ex-partner, her abuser, but also at the hands of these very powerful, well-connected gang members that had connections throughout Honduras. So because of this, Iris and her 4 daughters moved within Honduras several times, trying to find safety both from her abuser, but also from these gang members. But they were never able to. Honduras is a very small country. So because of this, Iris and her daughters fled to the United States in the fall of 2019. And they traveled for about a month through Guatemala and Mexico in order to reach the United States. And they had many difficulties throughout their journey, as you can imagine, including having been held hostage in Mexico for several days without food or water because they were unable to pay their captors for their release. Fortunately, they were able to escape that situation. They finally made it to the border, and Iris and her 3 biological daughters were separated from her non-biological daughter, who I mentioned she had raised since infancy, but she didn't have formal adoption papers or legal guardianship. And so Iris and her 3 biological daughters were placed into MPP proceedings, or what we call Remain in Mexico proceedings. And her non-biological daughter was placed in a different process in the United States. And so they've been separated since that point. And Iris, Iris doesn't know the status of her daughter's case at this point. So Iris and her 3 daughters were originally scheduled for their final hearing on their asylum application in May of this year, so May of 2020, which was already several months after their arrival at the border seeking protection. But that hearing was obviously canceled and continued until August because of the pandemic. And my colleague who represents Iris and her daughters was in constant contact with the court, with officials from the court in Texas, and with officials from the Department of Homeland Security to try to determine whether or not this hearing in August would go forward. But it was really chaos. Nobody could tell her if the hearing would go forward, when that decision would be made, or even who was going to make that decision, because there was not actually a judge assigned to the docket. And this is a very serious thing, because we were trying to prepare her for a final hearing on the merits of her case. It requires a ton of evidence. It requires a very detailed affidavit and all the supporting evidence that she could find, and preparing her for testimony, which is very difficult to do when she's living in a shelter. She doesn't have access to a private, confidential space. Very difficult to have the resources, not only just to support her and her daughters, but also to get the evidence that she needs from her home country and things like that. But finally, about 3 days before the hearing was supposed to go forward, my colleague received an email from court staff telling her that she, in fact, did need to travel to Texas, and Iris and her daughters did need to travel to the border because the hearing would not go forward, although they were not given a new hearing date. But later on, Iris was scheduled for a new final hearing date on her asylum application in May of 2021. So a year from when her hearing was originally scheduled, and about a year and a half from the time that she presented herself at the border to seek protection in the United States. And we don't know if this hearing will actually go forward either. That's, I think, one of the hardest parts of the asylum process right now, is we don't know what to expect, and we don't know how to explain that to our clients because anything could change at any time. So Iris has faced and will face many obstacles in her fight for asylum. And many of those are listed on the slide that you can see right now. All of the bars and the obstacles, all the regulations that will challenge her claim to asylum. And I'll kind of go through a few of them quickly, just to kind of highlight the obstacles that she and her daughters are facing. As I mentioned, she's subject to the migrant protection protocols or remain in Mexico proceedings. So everything has to be prepared from Mexico, which I kind of already went through all of the challenges that entails, but it's obviously less than ideal to not be able to prepare in person with your client. She's also subject to further regulations labeling her a threat to national security and a public health risk. And if the recently announced regulations go into effect, she, like many of our clients, will face very serious challenges to her claim, because she's first from a country with high levels of generalized violence, and because her claim is based on persecution she suffered on account of her gender and persecution she suffered at the hands of gang members, which those are two kinds of claims that are being particularly targeted in these new regulations. And she will face changes or face challenges in that with the new regulations, immigration judges will be allowed to introduce their own evidence and assign whatever weight to it that they see fit, which can severely prejudice her case as well. So these challenges that Iris has faced and will face, they're not, to be clear, they're not limited to our clients at the border. All of our clients here in the Midwest are subject to most of the same bars and challenges that we've kind of described here today, and access to counsel for them is equally as important to have a successful outcome in their case. But also, to be clear, although the challenges that asylum seekers face in light of these new bars and regulations seem overwhelming, and they're not impossible to overcome. Even with all the attacks over the past few years on the asylum process, we have continued to obtain protection for women like Iris, who fled persecution based on their gender, and persecution based on or at the hands of gang members, and will continue pursuing protection for her and for others like her, no matter what happens in the future. So thank you again for being here today. I'll pass it back to Azadeh.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So I think this particular, the situation of Iris really illustrates the Sisyphean task that we were talking about early on. She's already overcome so much to come to the United States and to ask for asylum, and unfortunately, she's just meeting barrier after barrier and having to restart this fight. So what are we doing about this? What is NIJC trying to do in order to support people like Iris, asylum seekers who are brave enough to wage this fight? So our policy team focuses greatly on elevating the story of asylum seekers such as Iris and ensuring that no one else has to go through this again. And we do that by educating the public and educating Congress through the timelines that you all have, really urging essentially the US public and legislators to stay informed about what's happening under their name and what's happening largely in the shadows in immigration courts these days and at the border. One of the things that we are also doing is we're supporting legislators who are standing up to call for the rescission of anti-asylum policies. So for example, on World Refugee Day this year, which was in June, we worked with Senator Blumenthal, who led a letter where over a third of the Senate, including Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, signed on and denounced all of these anti-asylum policies. It's a really beautiful 5-page letter if you all are interested, and I think it's in your materials as well. And basically, it's a moment where legislators have really gone on the record to say the promise of the Refugee Act has been broken, and it's way past time to actually fulfill our obligations under US and international law. But another thing that I can say that our team tries to do is our feeling, given the status of asylum these days, is that restoring the system of asylum is really the floor, it's not the ceiling. We should make sure that individuals like Iris are fully protected, because the harm that they flee from is actually is very much in line with the type of protection that asylum was created for. And so we really try to push as well so that the restrictive categories or the barriers that currently exist to asylum are lifted, so that it's not just about taking away the barriers that the Trump administration is trying to add, but also trying to think forward in terms of what a fair and just asylum system should look like. And so with that respect, we engage in the regulatory process in trying to build the record that, this is the steady trickle of regulations that this administration has been issuing are not fulfilling the promise of the Refugee Act and our international obligations. So there's one regulation that Amanda just mentioned, which is the one that I want to flag for you all to make sure that you're, if you're interested, that you're able to comment on it and lend your voice to that fight. And that regulation basically says that individuals who are in immigration court would have to file their asylum applications just 2 weeks after their first hearing. And so I know there's a lot of attorneys who are on this call already. If you've ever had to tackle an asylum application, I'm sure you would know that between the interpretation needs, the fact that most asylum seekers are traumatized or suffer from PTSD, many of them are children, right, and take time to trust and open up. The fact that evidence is often missing and you have to gather it. All of these factors, of course, the fact that many asylum seekers are detained, right? So that's a major barrier for them to comply with such a quick turnaround. So those kinds of changes would be really detrimental and would essentially virtually bar most asylum seekers from just filing the application. And the other thing that Amanda mentioned is that judges would have the opportunity to put their thumb on the scale and add evidence into the asylum case. So if you remember, there are judges in this country that we mentioned earlier on in the presentation who love to deny asylum claims, who actually deny 90% of asylum claims and believe that no one from Central America should win asylum. So those judges are going to have the opportunity to basically have evidence packages that are tailored to basically make the case that no one from Central America should get asylum, should win asylum. And they're going to be able to insert that into the record and prevent asylum seekers from actually having a due process hearing that reviews the merits of their individualized claim. So if you're interested and able, we really encourage you to participate in this comment campaign that we've prepared, and that's in your materials in the What Can You Do guide that Ellen has prepared in anticipation of this presentation. And of course, the other thing that NIJC does is, with people like Amanda, we're fighting asylum cases every day, right? So if you are an attorney and if you are interested, NIJC has a great team of advocates and a 90% approval rate for asylum claims. So that's a fight that we fight every day, despite the fact that, you have to continuously push that boulder up the hill. But every fight matters because literally it's a matter of life and death for most asylum seekers. So I'll turn it over to Ellen for the last slide.
Great, thank you. Get my webcam on here for just a second for our last couple minutes before we get to all of the great questions coming in. We have had a number of questions come in already, so if you have questions or comments, again, please put them in the chat box and we're gonna ramp up for those right now. But these presentations always there's so much going on. 2020 is really a beast, and like my colleagues have said, it takes a village to get this done and to preserve justice and access to justice for those that really need it. And so we have yet another comment that you can respond to and provide your comment in. It is the first action item in the What Can You Do handout that is attached. I think you just showing up today and listening to this presentation and maybe forwarding it on to a colleague or a family member is also a great way to get some information out there and say that there are things that we can do. If you are a pro bono attorney, or you work at a law firm and work with attorneys, please encourage the attorneys or please attend our upcoming legal trainings. We have our two-part asylum virtual trainings, October 19th and 21st from 1 to 2:30 Central Time. Those links are also available in the handouts and follow-up materials. Right now we have 68 cases, individuals and their families that need your representation, and so that we can keep pushing this boulder up. About 57 of them are asylum cases, and so we really appreciate your support there, because as you know, after all that you've heard today and all of the barriers that these individuals and their families face, the right to counsel or the right to representation does not exist in the United States for non-citizens in their immigration proceedings. So these individuals, without the assistance of attorneys, have to go at it alone. So you really can make a difference. For those of you that are not attorneys, but do speak or read and write in other languages, we are always using volunteer interpreters and translators. And we are particularly looking for Hindi, Punjabi, and then also a variety of other languages in West Africa. So if you speak any of those languages or know something that does, please register. The link is also in the What Can You Do materials. And then of course, vote. We're all part of this community, and so for those that can vote, please do. And finally, one last plug before we get to the Q&A is that October is Pro Bono Celebration Month, and so we are celebrating our volunteers and all the work that you do and the community that's come before us. And so on October 22nd, we have our first ever virtual pro bono celebration. And we'll be sending information so that the volunteers can join us in celebrating all of this great work and how we're really continuing to push forward. So as you are now submitting your comments and questions, I'm just going to say that if you've enjoyed this presentation or you would like to see possibly some other topics, please just take a second, hold your phone or your device up to this QR code, and a survey will pop up. We really do value your feedback, positive or for constructive criticism. Our next policy corner will be November 3rd. That is right. If there's not enough excitement that day, join us for an hour to see what else we can be doing on election day. So without further ado, then I'm actually going to call in my colleague Heidi here, and she is going to moderate our Q&A. I know that the questions have been flying, so Heidi, you want to jump in and start the questions?
Thanks, Ellen. Can you all hear me okay? We're so excited by how many of you there are on the call today. Thank you for being with us, and to Azadeh and Amanda and Ellen for such a great presentation about what is a really such a trying topic that's impacting so many with tragedy and harm. And so we appreciate the enthusiasm behind all these questions. And I should note that while the questions are being answered orally, we're going to continue to answer many of them in writing too. And I will put my email address in, and if your question is not answered, we are doing our best. But if we can't reach all of them, please don't hesitate to shoot me a note. So the first question I'm going to lift up and toss to Azadeh is if you could talk a little bit about the status of litigation that has been filed challenging the border closure for asylum seekers and unaccompanied kids.
Thank you. That's a really important question. It has taken a long time for those cases to come forward, given the shock of this pandemic and the resource issue, right, that all nonprofit organizations are facing these days. But thankfully, there is currently a pending class action lawsuit that is essentially headed by a child, I believe a 16-year-old Central American youth who is an asylum seeker. And this youth has been subjected to, or has been at risk of being subjected to expulsions, and was able to halt their expulsion from the United States thanks to this lawsuit, but has also extended that, is trying to extend that protection to everyone else who is subject to, all other children who are subject to these summary expulsions. So right now, the federal court is in Washington, D.C. is looking at whether to certify this class. And there are some very, very compelling findings that have already been made by the judge presiding on the case about how essentially the statutory justification for closing the border makes no sense, right? The administration through the CDC dug out a 65-year-old statute which has never been applied for immigration purposes and has essentially used that to shut the border entirely. And it seems that the judge in this case, at least the magistrate judge, has seen through their arguments. So there's a lot of progress that's being spearheaded by immigrant youth, asylum-seeking youth who are fighting this battle, and if they're able to succeed in that litigation, would be able to shield essentially everyone, because it would bring to bear the asylum protections that this administration is violating every day by returning asylum seekers to harm.
Thanks, Azadeh. There's quite a few questions coming in about how individuals or nonprofit, non-governmental organizations can help. So Azadeh, can you just give another roundup of how and where to access the click to comment campaign and other action alerts that we have relevant to the presentation today?
Yeah, so in your handouts, so on the right-hand side, there are 3 handouts that are available to you. 2 of them are timelines that we've discussed, and one of them is essentially what can you do PDF. And the first link in that what can you do, take action bullet point is prompting you to look at the pending regulation that is currently aimed at curtailing access to asylum applications in immigration court. So it's the rule that says that asylum seekers have to apply within 2 weeks and that judges can insert evidence into proceedings. And one of the things that we try to do with these comment campaigns is that we delve really deep into the legal ramifications and try to break it down so that community members as well as lawyers can participate in this. So if you are, if you're not a lawyer, if you're in a human rights organization, if you're just interested in defending the right to asylum, I would really recommend that you check out this link because we explain this rule further in layman terms, and we give you some language to get started in responding. Yeah,
that's great. Thanks, Azadeh. And I know that a lot of folks on the phone may have participated in some of our previous comment campaigns, and John has asked, sort of people put these comments in and spend a lot of time on that, and then where do things stand? So some of you may have participated in a presentation on the click to comment campaign for a rule that was issued in June and closed for comments in July that at NIJC we refer to as the monster rule because it was probably the most comprehensive assault on asylum protections today. So Azadeh and Amanda, I'm just going to throw out 2 questions in a row for both of you from the questions coming in here. One is, what is the status of that rule? Has it been finalized? And then the second question is, if that rule and the one that you're discussing today, were to be finalized, what would be the impact specifically on asylum seekers who have fled or are afraid of future persecution on the basis of gang violence and/or domestic violence?
Thank you, Heidi. I'm going to start really quickly on the update. It's still pending. There was incredible momentum this summer, so thank you, John. Thank you to everyone who has participated and commenting on this. 88,000 comments were submitted, which is a really high number for the regulatory process. And by law, the administration is supposed to look at every comment that is at least somewhat individualized. So your comments really matter, and they bring more scrutiny to this process. And we're just really hopeful that these comments are going to prevent the finalization of this rule, or at least really slow it down and prevent it from going into effect anytime soon. So I'm going to leave it to Amanda to talk about the impact.
So as I kind of mentioned before, we don't think that these regulations are going to foreclose protection for people who are fleeing gender-based violence or gang violence, because as we've done with these regulations over the past few years, there's going to be litigation. There's going to be, and hopefully they will be enjoined, as many of the regulations have been, and hopefully, they'll ultimately be found to not be legal. And so there's a lot of ways that we can continue to bring these claims and fight these claims through litigation in other ways, and we will continue to do that.
That's great, thank you. So there are so many questions coming in. It's wonderful. One question is, so there's a couple. Thank you to Nicholas for noting about the time period having closed. If you're able to put the link in where you're finding that, we can check it out. But I'm gonna raise up another question, which is if there is a change in administration, but also I'll just zoom this out to generally sort of what incoming administrations can do if they're interested in reversing previous regulations. And so, I can quickly answer that question, which is that an incoming administration has to follow the same notice and comment rules that are provided by the Administrative Procedures Act to rescind rules as they would have to issue new rules. So if the rule that we're discussing that you heard about from Azadeh and Amanda today were to be finalized, a new incoming administration could fully rescind or withdraw those rules by issuing proposed notice of that withdrawal and seeking public comment. So it would go through the same process that we're seeing today. There's also a process by which Congress can actually nullify regulations that were issued within a certain number of congressional working days in the previous session, if those rules are considered to be sufficiently significant in size. So there are a couple questions coming through along those lines. I'm just going to lift up another question here, which is about sort of the rules for issuing comments. So can NGOs issue comments or just individuals? And can people issue or submit more than one comment? So I'll toss those technical questions over to Ozzy.
Yeah, so NGOs are very much welcome to submit comments. One of the things that makes a comment compelling is really articulating the interest that you have in the rule. So for example, if you're an NGO that serves asylum seekers in one capacity or another, highlighting that is valuable in terms of why you are standing in opposition to the comment. But even individuals are able to submit comments. So we, the click to comment campaign that we hyperlink to, and if the link is inaccurate, we'll make sure to send it over to you all via email. That comment also just prompts you, to reflect in the ways in which you may have even asylum seekers in your family, right, or in your background, and how that experience alone and your valuing of asylum laws makes your voice matter in the regulatory process. So you should feel free to submit comments in that capacity. If you do submit more than one comment, the only thing I would flag is that it shouldn't be duplicative, because they basically have an algorithm that will detect when comments are copies of one another. So if you want to add more arguments later that you hadn't thought about before, then that's something that you can do through the process, so long as you're not duplicating.
Thanks, Azadeh. So I think I'm going to throw this out as our last question for the day. There have been, quite a few questions that have come up about sort of the impact of the rule we're talking about today, the rule that came out over the summer, and what we see as how the landscape would or wouldn't be different for asylum seekers if there is a change in administration. I'll add NIJC is not a C4 lobbying or electioneering organization, and so we're nonpartisan. What I will raise up, though, is that it has been really remarkable to see the escalation over the past 4 to 6 months of the number of anti-asylum proposed rules that have been coming out of this administration, and you can just sort of do a quick Google to see some really interesting commentary that is out there from journalists and others observing the timing and connection to the upcoming election. I think it is very destabilizing. And actually, I thank those of you who have put this in the questions, those of you who work with asylum seeking communities. It is very destabilizing for asylum seekers who are attempting to navigate and understand, often without a lawyer, the rules in front of them. And honestly, for advocates, you know, the advocates you're hearing from today, Azadeh and Amanda at NIJC and other advocates across the country, it is incredibly difficult to sort of maintain all of the zealous work that is necessary on case representation while doing our best to put together really thorough on the record responses to these very technical rules, hundreds of pages in length, coming one after the other. And I think it's become pretty clear to us that that sort of taking up of resources and energy from the advocacy community is not accidental. So, you know, Amanda, I don't know if you know, to close us, if you want to add anything that you maybe have heard or experienced from talking with and working with your clients about this sort of destabilizing impact.
Exactly. I think this is one of the hardest things about being an advocate representing asylum seekers right now, is because everything changes all the time. And, you know, asylum seekers have, by definition, you know, come from a lot of, have experienced a lot and have overcome a lot to get here already. And to not be able to explain in a organized way what they can expect or what's going to be coming next is really difficult, because that's one of the best things we can do as advocates is explain the process and help someone through that process. And we can't do that right now because things are constantly in flux, constantly changing. And you know, we're talking to other colleagues, it's become a full-time job just to keep up with the changes that are happening in the asylum process. So it's very disheartening, it's very frustrating for us as advocates, but also especially for our clients who just want to do what they're supposed to do to seek protection. And it's been really difficult to do that this year and over the past few years.
Thanks, Amanda. Azadeh, did you have any last thoughts along those lines?
Just really grateful to everyone for joining during your lunch hour, during, you know, the billions of Zoom meetings or calls that you have to talk about something that's frankly a bit of a heavy topic for the most part. But you know, we remain really hopeful at NIJC that our advocacy and hard work is going to really make a difference, and so far it has. So thank you so much for lending your time and support to this important cause.
Thank you all so much. I am typing my name and email address right here. I'm our policy director, and we're always happy to answer any questions that we didn't miss or that come to you after. And Ellen, I'll just toss it to you to close us.
I think you guys did great, and we're so glad that this continues to be a success. So we look forward to seeing everybody on November 3rd for our next Policy Corner. Until then, take care of yourselves and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.